Winter 1944. The snow fell quietly over a fenced field in Belgium, muffling the sounds of war that still echoed beyond the horizon. Inside the makeshift compound, rows of weary German soldiers stood behind barbed wire, their gray uniforms stiff with frost. Their faces were hollow from months of retreat, their eyes dulled by defeat and expectation. They had been told what would come next: humiliation, starvation, maybe execution. That was what the propaganda had promised them. Americans were savages in uniform, drunk on greed and vengeance. But when the gate opened, it wasn't soldiers with rifles who entered. It was young Americans carrying metal trays. The air filled with the smell of hot coffee and fresh bread. One GI, barely 20, handed a cup to a trembling German sergeant. The prisoner hesitated, then took it. Steam rose between them like a fragile truce. In that moment, the war's cruel logic cracked, because for the first time, German soldiers saw that the enemy was not what they had been told. Long before the first shot was fired at the Western Front, another war had already been raging. A war for perception. In Germany, Joseph Goebbels had spent years constructing an image of the Americans that was as strategic as any tank division. His ministry of propaganda was not simply about pride or morale. It was a weapon of obedience. If soldiers believed their enemy was monstrous, then hesitation would die before the first battle began. From 1939 onward, newspapers, films, and radio programs told a single story: that America was a land of chaos. According to Nazi reports, its people were lazy consumers, enslaved by money and ruled by Jews and corporations. Goebbels called it the empire of corruption disguised as democracy. In classrooms and army lectures, German soldiers were shown caricatures of American soldiers as drunk, violent, and racially degenerate. Jazz was mocked as nigger music, the sound of moral decay. Coca-Cola, Hollywood, and swing dancing were portrayed not as culture but contamination. This constant stream of distortion worked its way deep into the ranks of the Wehrmacht. Even educated officers believed they were marching against a cultureless, mechanized mob, men without tradition, fighting for nothing but self-indulgence. In Hitler's speeches, Americans were dismissed as mongrel soldiers of capitalism, a mixed race that could never stand against the disciplined German spirit. By 1943, when the tide of war began to shift, such language intensified. The Führer's voice on the radio warned troops that capture by the Allies meant death by humiliation, a phrase designed to burn fear into every retreating battalion. When American bombers began to darken German skies, the myth seemed momentarily validated. Cities in ruins, civilians buried beneath rubble, and the enemy faceless and mechanical. Yet beneath that destruction, another truth was forming. While Goebbels filled the airwaves with warnings of Allied barbarity, the Allies themselves were preparing for an entirely different kind of campaign. One that would rely not only on weapons, but on morality. By late 1944, millions of leaflets rained down from Allied planes over German positions. They carried no threats, only facts. Proof that prisoners of war were being fed, clothed, and treated under the Geneva Convention. The U.S. Army's Psychological Warfare Division understood something profound. In a war of total control, kindness could be subversive. If Nazi propaganda thrived on hatred, then mercy could quietly dismantle it from within. The first real tests came in North Africa and Italy. Captured German soldiers, conditioned to expect cruelty, found themselves treated with restraint and order. American officers permitted chaplains to visit, distributed cigarettes, and even allowed mail to be sent home. Reports filtered back through Red Cross channels, telling families that their sons were alive and unharmed. To the Nazi hierarchy, this was dangerous. To the men in the field, it was confusing. By the time D-Day arrived in June 1944, the dissonance between propaganda and reality had grown impossible to ignore. German soldiers on the front lines whispered among themselves, "The Americans are not what they said." Yet at this stage of the war, disbelief was still a weapon of survival. Many clung to the old image of the enemy, afraid that accepting the truth would mean acknowledging everything else that had been false. They didn't yet know that their surrender and even their humanity would soon be tested not by American bullets, but by American decency. The seed of doubt had been planted in their minds, but it would take the experience of capture itself to make it bloom. A lesson learned not on the battlefield, but behind the wire. While Nazi propaganda turned kindness into weakness, the United States military saw it as discipline. The American soldier, whether a farm boy from Iowa or a mechanic from Detroit, carried not only a rifle, but a sense of moral instruction that stretched back to the principles of the Republic. In the War Department's field manuals, even prisoners of war were to be treated not as enemies, but as men temporarily removed from battle. It wasn't sentimentality, it was strategy rooted in law and ethics. The United States had signed and ratified the 1929 Geneva Convention on the treatment of prisoners of war, and by 1942, when the first German POWs began arriving on American soil, the War Department wanted to prove that democracy could fight fiercely without becoming what it opposed. Camp commanders were instructed that food rations for prisoners must match those of U.S. troops. Each camp was required to have medical staff, reading material, and even educational programs to prevent idleness. For many Americans, the idea of treating enemy soldiers humanely seemed contradictory during a total war. But for the leadership, from General Eisenhower to President Roosevelt, it was an opportunity to demonstrate moral superiority. America's fight, they said, was not against the German people, but against Nazism. In speeches and policy, the line was drawn carefully. Punish the guilty leaders, not the indoctrinated youth. By 1943, over 400,000 German POWs were scattered across the United States, held in more than 700 camps stretching from Texas to Wisconsin. When trains carrying these prisoners rolled through small towns, Americans often lined the tracks, not with stones, but with curiosity. Some even waved. The prisoners themselves stared out at a country they had been told did not exist, a land of abundance, freedom, and strange equality. They saw farmers leaving milk bottles on porches, children running barefoot, churches ringing bells instead of air raid sirens. For men who had spent years under totalitarian order, it was like glimpsing another planet. Their guards, often not much older than themselves, spoke casually and laughed easily. There was no fear in their posture, no need to shout to command obedience. To the Germans, raised in the rigid hierarchy of the Wehrmacht, this informality was baffling, even threatening to their sense of order. Inside the camps, that dissonance deepened. Instead of cruelty, they found routines, inspections, meals, work assignments carried out with predictable fairness. In some camps, prisoners worked in local farms or factories for small wages, often alongside American civilians. Letters from these camps began reaching Germany through the Red Cross, carrying a dangerous truth. The Americans treat us well. They are not what we were told. Such letters slipped quietly through the cracks of the Nazi censorship machine, eroding the myth from within. By 1944, even captured officers began to notice how American policy was psychological warfare in its most refined form. An Oberleutnant captured in Tunisia wrote, "They feed us as they feed themselves. They even allow our wounded to rest before their own." That single observation, when read by comrades back home, carried more impact than any Allied leaflet. Intelligence officers understood that each prisoner treated with decency could become a living instrument against Nazi ideology. Kindness was not weakness. It was persuasion through example. And so, as the war pressed deeper into Europe, and as captured Germans began to fill compounds in France, Belgium, and England, the propaganda machine's foundation began to crumble. The men who had been promised American brutality now stood face to face with something far more disarming: empathy. It was in those quiet, cold camps, not in the thunder of artillery, that the first cracks appeared in the Nazi illusion. Because nothing dismantled hatred faster than being handed a warm meal by the enemy you had been taught to despise. For German soldiers, the first hours in American custody were often filled with dread, a silence dense with expectation. They had been warned that capture meant degradation, that they would be beaten, starved, or paraded as trophies. Yet, when those first days unfolded, the shock was not violence, but civility. The same Americans who had shelled their positions hours earlier now carried them to field hospitals, changed their bandages, or offered them cigarettes. It was not compassion they expected to find in the face of the enemy, least of all from the Americans, who, according to Goebbels, were soft and decadent. But these were men raised in a democracy that had taught them to separate an ideology from the individual. A German prisoner might be an enemy soldier, but he was also a man, perhaps even a farmer, a father, or a son, reflections of themselves. That quiet realization began to ripple through the captured ranks like something dangerously contagious: empathy. The cultural contrast was immediate and disorienting. German order met American informality head-on. Guards greeted prisoners with relaxed smiles, sometimes calling them boys. Prisoners watched in disbelief as American sergeants joked with their officers or called them by their first names, a gesture that would have been unthinkable in the Wehrmacht. The strict hierarchy of Nazi Germany met the horizontal spirit of democracy, and it unsettled them deeply. For many prisoners, the greatest shock came not from the treatment itself, but from what it revealed about the enemy's world. They saw black soldiers and white soldiers sharing rations, even if segregation still existed elsewhere in American life. They saw American nurses tending to wounded German soldiers with the same calm efficiency as their own. And in some camps, they heard something they had been told was degenerate noise: jazz and swing music drifting from radios in the guard towers. The rhythm of that music, alien and alive, whispered a kind of freedom they had never known. One former Luftwaffe pilot, captured in France, later recalled his disbelief. "They gave me coffee. They asked if I was cold. They called me sir. I thought, this is a trick." But the trick never ended. For weeks, that disbelief lingered, replaced eventually by something that frightened the Nazi mind more than defeat: admiration. The German soldiers began to see what had been hidden from them: a society that was messy, diverse, imperfect, but alive. It didn't rely on fear to function. The soldiers guarding them had not been threatened into loyalty. They believed in what they were fighting for. That difference pierced through propaganda like sunlight through fog. The American camp system itself became a strange mirror of values. Work was encouraged, but not enforced by brutality. Education programs were offered, including lessons on democracy and literature. Prisoners built furniture, played soccer, and wrote letters that were actually delivered. For men conditioned to obey, to live under suspicion and censorship. This trust was as alien as it was liberating. Local communities near the camps began to notice too. In parts of the American Midwest, farmers employed German POWs to help harvest crops. Families sometimes left pies or sandwiches on fence posts for the men. Small acts of humanity that even the guards could not stop. A few friendships were quietly born. Some Americans pitied these young Germans, realizing that many were victims of a system rather than its architects. But for the Germans, every act of kindness carried a double edge. It created gratitude and guilt. Gratitude because they were being treated as men again after years of being used as tools. Guilt because they had believed and served lies. That emotional fracture widened the more they saw of American life. Each act of mercy became a quiet revelation, and every revelation a blow to the ideological armor they had carried since childhood. By late 1944, letters and reports from returning prisoners circulated quietly in the Wehrmacht. They spoke of American food, fair treatment, and humane officers. Some even confessed admiration for American freedom. These accounts, though small, began to corrode the Nazi myth from within. A propaganda officer in Berlin lamented privately that the prisoners have become the Allies' loudspeakers. What Goebbels could never imagine was that the strongest weapon America would wield in the psychological war was not its tanks or bombers, but its ordinary humanity. And yet, the U.S. military understood exactly what it was doing, because kindness was not merely moral, it was tactical. By the winter of 1944, as the Allied front pressed deeper into Europe, the psychological effects of American prisoner treatment were being felt in ways that no bullet or bomb could achieve. Behind every captured German, there was a story spreading through whispers, stories of meals shared, wounds tended, and unexpected dignity. To the U.S. military's Psychological Warfare Division, these weren't coincidences, they were instruments of strategy. American intelligence had long studied the enemy's psychology. They understood that the Nazi regime maintained control through fear, propaganda, and dehumanization, both of the enemy and of its own people. If that system depended on the illusion of moral superiority, then breaking it required a mirror to show the German soldier what decency outside fascism looked like. And that mirror was built not through speeches or leaflets alone, but through human interaction. When the U.S. Army captured German divisions in North Africa, Italy, and France, it found that propaganda was far more fragile than the German war machine itself. Prisoners who had sworn loyalty to Hitler were bewildered to find American officers following international law with precision, often granting them comforts not extended to their own troops in the field. The Americans didn't need to humiliate their captives to prove dominance. Their discipline was dominance. This consistent humanity began to shift the war's moral axis. Allied interrogators noticed that German soldiers who had experienced fair treatment were far more willing to provide information, not because they were coerced, but because they felt safe. Prisoners who trusted their captors often spoke honestly about supply shortages, unit morale, or command failures. It wasn't forced betrayal. It was human communication, something long suppressed under Nazi rule. Meanwhile, the Nazi high command was terrified by these developments. Propaganda units attempted to suppress returning POW letters, labeling them enemy disinformation. Yet even censored, the truth seeped through the cracks. Families whispered that their sons had been treated well in American camps. Entire towns began to question whether the enemy was truly barbaric, a thought that could unravel the regime's moral authority from the inside. In one documented case, an intercepted letter from a German prisoner in Kansas described his astonishment at being served meat and vegetables daily alongside hot coffee. He wrote, "If this is how the enemy treats us, then perhaps everything we were told has been a lie." That single line encapsulated what Allied commanders had come to understand. Mercy could be more corrosive to tyranny than violence. On the battlefield, this truth had measurable results. Reports from the Western Front showed that German units were increasingly more likely to surrender to American forces than to Soviet ones. Soldiers whispered among themselves that capture by the Americans meant life, while capture by the Red Army meant death. The result was strategic. Tens of thousands laid down their arms sooner, shortening battles and saving Allied lives. To German officers loyal to the regime, this was unthinkable. They had built their careers on discipline and fear. Now, those foundations were collapsing under the weight of decency. They saw their men hesitate, their fanaticism draining away as they realized that the enemy was not a monster, but a reflection of something long forgotten: normal humanity. Even in American command circles, the power of this psychological victory was recognized. Reports from intelligence officers described POWs who volunteered for anti-Nazi re-education programs, who spoke openly about their disillusionment with the Reich. Some later joined Allied translation units or broadcasting efforts aimed at demoralizing remaining Nazi forces. Their words carried more weight than any American propaganda ever could, because they came from men who had seen the truth with their own eyes. But this campaign of quiet persuasion was not without moral complexity. Some American soldiers resented the generous treatment of their former enemies. They had seen comrades die in Normandy and the Ardennes, and the idea of feeding and sheltering Germans seemed unjust. Yet the higher command held firm, because in the larger war for civilization, restraint itself was proof of strength. In the end, the Nazis' attempt to paint Americans as monsters collapsed under the simplest contradiction imaginable: a meal, a handshake, a clean bandage. Each act of compassion dismantled the carefully built architecture of hate. Goebbels' words, shouted through 1,000 radios, could not compete with a single moment of lived reality. And as the Allies marched into Germany in 1945, many soldiers on both sides already understood: the war for territory was ending. But the war for truth had only just begun. By the summer of 1944, the thunder of the Allied invasion had shaken Europe to its core. On June 6th, the beaches of Normandy erupted under fire, a storm of iron and courage that marked the beginning of Germany's end. The Wehrmacht fought with the discipline of desperation, but the tide had turned. As divisions crumbled under the relentless push from the West, thousands of German soldiers found themselves surrounded, cut off, and captured. Among them were men who had spent years absorbing Nazi propaganda about the Americans, the mongrel army of merchants, the nation without soul or order. And yet, what they witnessed on the beaches, in the hedgerows, and behind Allied lines shattered that illusion forever. In the hours after the D-Day landings, U.S. medical corpsmen moved across the battlefield, tending to the wounded without discrimination. Photographs later showed American medics bandaging German prisoners lying beside American soldiers, enemies only hours before. To the German mind, conditioned to see compassion as weakness, this was incomprehensible. Field reports from U.S. Army intelligence reveal hundreds of similar encounters. Captured Germans, trembling with exhaustion, were offered water and blankets instead of interrogation. In one documented case, near St. Lo, an American captain halted his men from striking a captured SS officer. His words were simple: "We're soldiers, not savages." Those who witnessed it never forgot. Such moments were not isolated acts of decency. They reflected an institutional mindset that came from the top. General Dwight D. Eisenhower had made it clear to his forces: prisoners were to be treated according to the law. No exceptions, no vengeance. He understood what many strategists did not. The world was watching. The conduct of American troops would define not only victory, but the moral legitimacy of democracy itself. Meanwhile, within the German ranks, confusion spread like smoke. Prisoners captured in France and Belgium began comparing notes. The food was fair, the guards spoke without malice, and the discipline, though strict, was human. Many could not comprehend it. One captured lieutenant confessed, "I waited for the cruelty to begin, but it never came." To the Nazi state, these stories were poison. They threatened the very foundation of loyalty built on fear. When the Wehrmacht propaganda units tried to counter the reports by labeling them fabricated Allied lies, it was already too late. The men who had seen it firsthand knew otherwise. The illusion had fractured, and through that fracture poured a dangerous truth: that the Reich had not only deceived the world, but its own sons. This realization deepened during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. As Hitler's last major offensive faltered, tens of thousands of Germans were captured by American forces in the Ardennes. Many were young, some barely 18. Expecting brutality, they found instead warmth, literal and moral. American camps provided them with food, medical care, and even Christmas services. For soldiers who had spent years under a banner of hate, the dissonance was unbearable. Accounts from those camps describe a silence among prisoners that was heavier than any chain. It wasn't defeat that broke them. It was decency. One SS officer reportedly wept as a chaplain prayed over him, unable to reconcile the act with everything he had been taught about the enemy without honor. In those moments, the propaganda empire of Joseph Goebbels began to collapse, not through argument, but through contradiction. Reality had exposed the lie. American soldiers themselves noticed the shift. Interrogators reported that captured Germans grew increasingly cooperative, often volunteering information about unit movements or supply lines. They weren't coerced. They were disarmed in spirit. The psychological victory was complete. By treating their captives as men, the Americans had done what the Nazi state could not: awaken the humanity buried beneath uniform and oath. For the Germans, that awakening came at a cost. It meant realizing that their obedience had served a regime that feared kindness because it revealed the truth, that empathy, not ideology, was the real measure of civilization. As 1944 bled into 1945, the moral center of the war shifted quietly from the battlefield to the prison camps. The rifles were still firing, but the real revolution, the collapse of belief, was already underway behind the wire. By early 1945, the Allies were advancing into Germany itself, and with every mile, another layer of illusion peeled away. The propaganda that had once painted Americans as monsters now stood in ruins, eroded not by speeches, but by experience. Inside the prison compounds, scattered across Europe and the United States, thousands of captured Germans began living a truth that Goebbels could never permit. They were safer with the enemy than with their own leaders. In American-run camps across France, Belgium, and the UK, life was surprisingly structured and, in its order, humane. Prisoners were woken each morning to breakfast rations that often exceeded what front-line German units received. There were work details, recreation, and even music, harmonicas, improvised guitars, and songs of home echoing across wire fences. Guards watched, but rarely barked orders. Some camps even held Sunday church services led by both American and German chaplains. It wasn't paradise. There was still discipline, loss, and uncertainty. But there was also something dangerously contagious: normalcy. For men who had lived years under the totalitarian control of the Nazi regime, that simple stability was revolutionary. Reports from the U.S. Office of War Information describe a striking pattern. German prisoners exposed to this treatment began showing signs of psychological reorientation. In interviews, many expressed shock not at defeat, but at discovery, discovering that their supposed enemies lived by rules of fairness, openness, and even humor. One POW wrote home via Red Cross correspondence, "The Americans are firm, but they smile. They listen. They even let us speak." That tone of astonishment appeared again and again in the letters that filtered back to Germany. Prisoners described guards who shared cigarettes, doctors who treated wounds without questions, and American civilians who brought books or bread to the camps. These were not the beasts that Goebbels had described in the newsreels. They were people. And for the German families who read these words, often in secret, the revelation was shattering. The Nazi regime tried desperately to suppress this correspondence. Letters from POWs were heavily censored. Entire paragraphs blacked out before delivery. But words have a way of surviving censorship. Short phrases: "I am well fed," "We are treated correctly," "The guards are fair," pass through unaltered. And each phrase carried more weight than 1,000 pamphlets. For those still fighting on the front, rumors spread like wildfire. Entire units began surrendering en masse to American forces, hoping for humane treatment. In the last months of the war, U.S. divisions reported growing instances of German soldiers waving white cloths long before Allied troops reached their lines. The Nazi high command saw this as treason. The soldiers saw it as self-preservation, and perhaps, in some quiet sense, as moral relief. By spring 1945, as the Allies liberated concentration camps and the world saw the full scale of Nazi cruelty, the contrast between the two sides became undeniable. Even hardened German officers who had mocked American softness were now forced to confront an unanswerable question. If their enemy could act with humanity, what did that make of them? In one recorded interrogation near Remagen, a German major confessed, "We were told that you Americans were animals, but you are not. We were the ones who became that." His words, like so many others, reflected a deeper collapse than military defeat. It was the death of ideological certainty. American intelligence officers began using these testimonies in their psychological operations. Broadcasts beamed into Germany featured the voices of captured soldiers describing humane treatment. Leaflets dropped over Wehrmacht positions quoted their own men. "I am alive. The Americans feed us. Do not fear capture. ... What Goebbels had built over a decade, a fortress of lies designed to shield the German mind, was now being dismantled by the words of his own soldiers. By the war's end in May 1945, millions of German POWs had experienced this strange inversion of expectation. They had entered captivity fearing torture and left it transformed by decency. When many of them returned home years later, they carried those memories like contraband, quiet proof that everything they had believed about the outside world had been a fabrication. Historians would later call it one of the most effective psychological victories of the war, a triumph not of propaganda, but of humanity. For in a conflict defined by death and hatred, it was compassion that struck the final, silent blow. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe was a continent of ghosts. Cities lay in ruins, families scattered, and ideologies shattered. Yet among the millions of returning prisoners, those who had spent months or years under American custody, there emerged a quieter kind of reconstruction, a rebuilding of conscience. For many German soldiers, captivity had been their first encounter with an unfiltered truth. The world outside Nazi Germany was not chaotic, immoral, or godless. It was structured by law and tempered by compassion. That realization didn't vanish when they stepped off the transport trains that carried them back across a broken homeland. It lingered, a seed planted behind barbed wire, growing now among the ashes of defeat. Post-war interviews conducted by Allied and German sociologists revealed an extraordinary pattern. A significant percentage of returning POWs expressed admiration for the Americans. Not for their power, but for their fairness. They spoke of guards who treated them as equals, of discipline that came without cruelty, of small acts of civility that became moral revelations. Many openly admitted that their time in captivity had changed how they viewed freedom, responsibility, and even authority. One former Panzer commander described it simply: "The Americans fought us hard, but they never hated us." That was what destroyed our belief in the Reich. This transformation did not occur in isolation. It rippled outward, influencing the moral climate of post-war Germany in ways few could have predicted. Among educators, intellectuals, and even former officers, there was a growing acknowledgement that the war had been not just a military defeat, but an ethical collapse. And in contrast, the conduct of the Americans, from the battlefield to the prison camps, became an unspoken lesson in what moral strength looked like. The Allied occupation authorities took note. U.S. re-education programs for returning POWs were designed not as indoctrination, but as conversation. They introduced democratic principles, civic duty, and the value of questioning authority, lessons that resonated precisely because they had already been witnessed, not merely taught. The men who had experienced fair treatment in captivity became, in many cases, some of the most open to democratic reform. The irony was striking. The same propaganda that had tried to inoculate German soldiers against American decadence had, through its collapse, made them more receptive to American ideals. When the lies fell apart, the truth that replaced them came not from pamphlets, but from memory, of music heard through camp radios, of food shared without mockery, of respect that needed no uniform. Historians now see this as one of the least recognized victories of the war, a moral triumph achieved without bloodshed. By defeating hatred with humanity, the Americans accomplished what armies rarely do: they changed minds. Yet this moral victory also carried weight for the Americans themselves. Many veterans, reflecting years later, said that treating prisoners well had reaffirmed their own faith in what they were fighting for. In the ruins of Europe, it reminded them that democracy's greatest weapon was not its arsenal, but its principles. And for the German prisoners who carried those memories home, it became the quiet foundation of something new. The conviction that decency, even between enemies, could outlast ideology. In the wake of Germany's surrender, the moral geography of the world had shifted. The images of concentration camps, the testimonies of survivors, and the magnitude of Nazi crimes had left humanity reeling. Yet amid this horror, a paradox emerged. The victors' restraint had preserved something fragile but vital: the belief that decency could survive even the darkest era of war. For the United States, the humane treatment of German prisoners became a cornerstone of its emerging global image. It wasn't merely about following international law. It was about defining the New World Order through behavior. When the Nuremberg trials began in late 1945, the contrast between the defendants' brutality and the Allied conduct toward their captives was glaring. The victors could stand before the world and claim not only military success, but moral legitimacy. This legitimacy carried weight beyond Europe. As the Cold War dawned, the same moral strength that had softened German hearts became America's most powerful propaganda weapon against Soviet totalitarianism. Reports of fair POW treatment were cited in international forums, reinforcing the idea that Western democracy fought not only for survival, but for principle. In a divided world, ethics itself became a front line. Meanwhile, within Germany, the influence of those former prisoners continued to shape Reconstruction. Many became teachers, local officials, or advocates for civic responsibility in the new West German state. They were men who had lived under dictatorship, then seen the humanity of their supposed enemies, and that perspective made them invaluable to the fragile democracy that emerged. The quiet decency they had witnessed in captivity became a moral compass for post-war generations. In towns across America, too, memories of those wartime camps endured. Farmers who had employed German prisoners during harvest seasons spoke years later of their discipline and politeness. Some wrote letters across the ocean to the men who had once worked beside them, forming friendships that defied history's brutality. Decades later, reunions would take place, American families hosting former German POWs who returned not as enemies, but as guests. One such reunion in 1984, held in Texas, saw American guards and former prisoners embrace as old men. "We thought you would kill us," one said through tears, "but you showed us how to live again." It was a moment that captured the unspoken truth of that war, that the greatest victories often occur not when an army conquers a nation, but when it restores a soul. Of course, not every experience was pure. Some camps, particularly in Europe's chaos at war's end, faced shortages, harsh conditions, or mismanagement. Yet even in those, the systemic intent was different from the cruelty of Axis camps. Where the Nazis had used prisoners to erase humanity, the Americans tried, despite hardship, to preserve it. In hindsight, historians have recognized this moral consistency as one of the quiet pillars of Allied success. It was not only about winning battles, it was about proving that civilization could survive mechanized hatred. The kindness shown to enemy soldiers didn't weaken the American war effort. It strengthened it, turning compassion into strategy and decency into deterrence. When Goebbels' empire of lies finally fell, it was not crushed by force alone. It died from contradiction, from the sight of prisoners eating warm food, from letters that described fairness instead of torment, from the realization that truth could be verified in a cup of coffee shared across enemy lines. In the end, the story of how American kindness destroyed Nazi propaganda is not a sentimental legend, it is a lesson. It reminds us that even in war, the most effective victories are those that speak to conscience, not conquest, and that sometimes the most devastating weapon a nation can wield is mercy itself. History often remembers war for its fire, the destruction, the cruelty, the roar of machines tearing through silence. Yet, in the long shadow of World War II, one truth endures that rarely finds its way into textbooks: that kindness, when wielded with discipline, can strike harder than hate. For the German soldiers who walked through the gates of American POW camps expecting brutality, what they found instead was disarming. It was the sound of a guard offering a cigarette, the sight of an American medic tending to an enemy's wounds, the warmth of food shared in a winter that should have frozen their souls. Each act chipped away at a system built on lies. Each smile carried a quiet defiance against the machinery of hate. It is easy to win a battle with strength, far harder to win one with restraint. The Americans who upheld those standards of conduct, even after seeing comrades fall, carried the weight of something greater than victory, the preservation of humanity itself. They fought not only for freedom, but for proof that freedom could remain moral. When those German prisoners returned home, they did not carry stories of vengeance. They carried stories of contradiction, of how their enemy had shown them a world that was lawful, fair, even kind. And in that contradiction lay the true collapse of Nazi propaganda. For every city rebuilt, for every democracy reborn from the ruins, the memory of that decency remained. Quiet, steadfast, undeniable. It taught that the strongest form of power is not domination, but integrity. Because in the end, wars end. Propaganda fades, nations change. But the image of an enemy showing mercy, that lingers. It lingers in the conscience of those who survive and becomes the foundation for something greater than revenge, understanding. And so, the most enduring victory of the Second World War may not have been written in treaties or celebrated in parades. It was written in those small, unrecorded moments of grace, when a soldier chose not to hate,